Picture this. It's early 1997, yeah? Tony Blair became prime minister, post-grunge has turned alternative rock into corporate slop, and in a dusty mansion in Bath, 5 Oxford graduates are about to accidentally deliver the death blow to 3 years of musical mediocrity while making the most beautiful nightmare ever recorded. Their names? Thom, Jonny, Ed, Colin, and Phil. Their band? Radiohead. Their mission? Prove that rock music could be both intellectually ambitious and emotionally devastating. This is the story of OK Computer, the album that didn't just change music, it showed everyone else how embarrassingly far behind they'd fallen. But first, let's talk about the absolute state of rock music in 1997. While Radiohead were crafting their masterpiece, the rest of the rock world was busy creating the blandest, most focused group music in history. After Kurt Cobain died, in a story I've already told, for 3 years alternative rock wasn't really going somewhere. Post-grunge bands like Bush and Collective Soul had taken the raw power of grunge and turned it into radio-friendly mush. Foo Fighters had just released The Color and the Shape, which was good and catchy, but nowhere near what he had done with Nirvana. Nu metal was starting to rear its backwards cap-wearing head with bands such as Deftones, Korn, and Sepultura. American indie rock was still stuck in lo-fi slacker mode with bands such as Guided by Voices and Pavement. And Britpop? Bands like Oasis and Blur were great, fun, and witty, but they weren't revolutionary by any means. And by 1997, well, Oasis had just released Be Here Now, a cocaine-bloated mess that proved the movement had completely lost the plot, in another story I've already told. Meanwhile, Radiohead, who'd been lumped in with the Britpop crowd after Creep, had been quietly plotting their escape since the Bends. While everyone else was still trying to be working-class heroes, Radiohead were reading Noam Chomsky and having existential crises about the information age. The breaking point with the Britpop scene had been brewing for years, culminating in what can only be described as peak music industry pettiness. According to fan accounts, Thom had attended a party thrown by Justine Frischmann, the Elastica frontwoman who was dating Damon Albarn at the time. The story goes that Damon and Justine were particularly unpleasant to Thom, treating him with the kind of industry condescension that would make anyone want to write a revenge song. Frischmann's severe haircut at the time became the inspiration for the line, "Her Hitler hairdo is making me feel ill." It was personal, petty, and perfect ammunition for what would become Karma Police. Oasis had coke far up their noses and their noses far up their own asses. Blur were singing stereotypes and getting stereotyped. Radiohead looked at the circus and thought, what if we made music for people's brains instead of their beer goggles? The recording process was Radiohead's deliberate attempt to create something as far from both their previous work and the musical wasteland around them as possible. "We didn't want to make the Bends Part 2, Thom explained. "We wanted to make something that would completely confuse people who thought they knew what Radiohead sounded like." The recording process was typically Radiohead, equal parts genius and complete madness. They started in their converted shed studio in Oxfordshire, which they'd charmingly named Canned Applause, trying to self-produce because they thought they knew better than everyone else. Spoiler alert, they didn't. "We're jumping from song to song, and when we started to run out of ideas, we'd move on to a new song," drummer Phil Selway later admitted. "The stupid thing was that we were nearly finished when we'd move on because so much work had gone into them." Enter Nigel Godrich, the 24-year-old engineer who'd worked on the Bends and would become Radiohead's unofficial 6th member. Nigel looked at their chaotic process and basically became their musical therapist, the guy who could tell them when to stop tweaking and actually finish something. But the real breakthrough came when they moved to St. Catherine's Court, a 15th-century mansion near Bath, owned by actress Jane Seymour. This wasn't just a change of venue, it was like plugging their creativity directly into the English countryside's ancient electrical grid. The house was basically empty except for corporate conference equipment, which was perfect because Radiohead needed space to lose their minds productively. They recorded exit music for a film on the stone staircase, using the natural reverb of medieval architecture. Let Down was captured in the ballroom at 3 a.m. because that's when the ghosts were most cooperative. They were turning the entire mansion into their instrument. The band made extensive use of the EMI TG-12345 mixing console, the same model used by Pink Floyd for The Dark Side of the Moon. This console allowed for a warmer, analog sound that complemented the album's futuristic themes. The band also incorporated digital recording and editing, which was still relatively new at the time. They used a digital audio workstation called Pro Tools to manipulate and layer sounds in ways that were previously impossible. This blending of analog warmth and digital precision gave OK Computer its unique sonic character. The production techniques were revolutionary in ways that are still being copied today. Instead of the standard practice of recording each instrument separately, they recorded most of the album live, with everyone playing in the same room. Ed O'Brien estimated that 80% of the album was recorded live. I hate doing overdubs because it just doesn't feel natural. Something special happens when you're playing live. They used no audio separation, meaning guitar amps, drums, and vocals were all bleeding into each other's microphones, creating this organic, breathing quality that made the album feel alive. It was the opposite of the pristine clinical production that dominated the 90s rock. It sounded like 5 people in a room having a collective nervous breakdown. The album that came out of this was a systematic dismantling of everything 1997 rock represented. Where post-grunge was formulaic, OK Computer was unpredictable. Where American alternative was slacker, OK Computer was ambitious. Where Britpop was nostalgic, OK Computer was prophetic. I had been reading a lot about the way that the computer age was going to make everyone much happier and everything was going to be much easier, Thom later explained. And I thought, hang on a minute, this doesn't feel right. This was 1996, remember, before social media, before smartphones, before anyone really understood what the internet was going to do to us. But somehow Thom saw it coming. Airbag opens the album like a statement of intent, literally about surviving a car crash, but metaphorically about surviving modern existence. The production uses drum samples from DJ Shadow, immediately signaling this wasn't going to be another album of straightforward rock songs. The Foo Fighters were making therapy rock about Dave Grohl's divorce. Radiohead were making music for the psychological cost of being alive in the late 20th century. Paranoid Android was inspired by Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and a traumatic night in an LA bar full of cocaine-addled industry types. It was their most ambitious statement yet. 6 minutes of pure musical chaos structured like a prog rock suite, but instead of singing about fantasy worlds, they were diagnosing the psychological damage of corporate culture. The lyrics came to me at 5 in the morning, Thom recalled about Paranoid Android. I was trying to sleep and I literally heard these voices that wouldn't leave me alone. They were the voices of the people that I'd heard in the bar. It turned out to be a notorious coke den, but I didn't know that. Basically, it's just about chaos. Utter fucking chaos. While Bush were making Razorblade Suitcase, more competent but ultimately forgettable post-grunge, Radiohead created Let Down, possibly the most beautiful song about disappointment ever recorded. It was captured in the mansion's ballroom at 3 a.m. using the natural reverb of medieval architecture. American alternative bands were celebrating slacker apathy. Radiohead were actually showing you what existential emptiness felt like. Karma Police became their biggest hit by accident, originally written as an inside joke about the band's internal politics. But the song's real power came from its specificity. This wasn't just about cosmic justice, it was about very particular people who'd behaved badly. The Hitler hairdo line was Thom's memory of Justine Frischmann's severe haircut, while references to people who talk in maths and buzz like a fridge could apply to anyone obsessed with chart positions and commercial success. The Gallagher brothers and Damon Albarn's obsession with sales figures during the Battle of Britpop made them obvious targets. Sometimes the best art comes from settling scores. Fitter Happier was perhaps the album's most radical statement, a computer voice reading self-improvement mantras over ambient music. While American indie bands were still making lo-fi music about nothing in particular, Radiohead were predicting the entire wellness industry and its inherent emptiness. It was also a complete rejection of post-grunge's emotional directness. Instead of Gavin Rossdale screaming about his feelings, you got a machine reciting the lies people tell themselves. Electioneering was the album's one concession to conventional rock dynamics, but even this felt urgent and paranoid in ways that mainstream alternative never did. While Foo Fighters were making My Hero, a perfectly fine but ultimately safe radio song, Radiohead were warning about democratic processes being corrupted by corporate interests. No Surprises might have been the album's cruelest joke, a lullaby about the soul-crushing nature of suburban conformity. It sounded prettier than anything most 97 rock bands could manage, but the lyrics were basically a suicide note for the middle class. I'll take a quiet life, a handshake of carbon monoxide, the lyrics read. Thom described it as a fucked-up nursery rhyme. When OK Computer was released on May 21, 1997, it immediately made everything else sound dated. Foo Fighters' The Color and the Shape was a solid album, but it felt like music from another era. Earnest, straightforward, and ultimately limited in its ambitions. Bush's Razorblade Suitcase sounded like exactly what it was, competent professionals going through the motions. American indie rock was still stuck in lo-fi slacker mode with bands such as Guided by Voices and Pavement. The album proved that rock music could be both futuristic without losing its humanity. While nu metal was just starting to emerge, mixing rap and metal in the least sophisticated ways possible, Radiohead had already figured out how to incorporate electronic elements without sacrificing emotional impact. While post-grunge bands were content to recycle the same chord progressions, Radiohead created entirely new sonic palettes. The cultural impact was immediate and lasting. OK Computer didn't just predict social media anxiety, it predicted the entire psychological framework of 21st century existence. The feelings of technological overwhelm, political helplessness, and social alienation that Thom was experiencing in 1997 became universal human experiences by 2010. While most 1997 rock albums now sound like historical curiosities. More importantly, it changed how artists thought about their responsibility to their audience. Before OK Computer, most rock bands were content to either rage against abstract concepts or whine about personal problems. Radiohead proved you could make music that was both deeply personal and broadly relevant, both accessible and intellectually challenging. The album influenced everyone from Muse to Coldplay, but more importantly, it raised the bar for what rock music could be. Suddenly, making another generic post-grunge album wasn't enough. You had to have something to say about the world, not just your feelings. The techniques they pioneered, live recordings in unconventional spaces, using electronic elements organically, treating the studio as an instrument, became standard practice for any band with serious artistic ambitions. 28 years later, OK Computer sounds less like a period piece and more like a documentary. Meanwhile, most 1997 rock albums sound exactly like what they were, products of a music industry that had run out of ideas and was just recycling the past. The Foo Fighters are still making competent rock music, but they never again approached the ambition of what Radiohead achieved in that mansion. Post-grunge bands either evolved or disappeared. Britpop collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. In the end, OK Computer succeeded because it refused to accept the limitations that every other 1997 rock band took for granted. While everyone else was making music for specific demographics, Radiohead made music for anyone capable of complex thought. While others were content to recycle the past, Radiohead imagined a future and then made it sound beautiful and terrifying at the same time. The album proved that in an era of corporate focus groups and market research, the best art still comes from trusting your instincts and refusing to compromise. It showed that you could be both experimental and accessible, both challenging and commercial, both angry and beautiful. And honestly, in 2025, when we're all walking around with anxiety about technology, politics, and human connection, it feels less like prophecy and more like the most accurate documentary ever made about what it means to be alive in the modern world. So, there you have it. The story of how 5 awkward Oxford graduates accidentally made the rest of rock music look embarrassingly primitive by refusing to accept that good enough was actually good. If this caffeinated deep dive into late 90s musical superiority complex has managed to hold your attention longer than whatever algorithm-optimized content you were probably supposed to be consuming, maybe consider subscribing. I promise to keep explaining why your favorite bands from decades past were either visionary geniuses or complete frauds, depending on how the research goes.